to connect to LinkedIn. They actually did a pretty good job with it. I got to configure X on there next. Still connecting. Like I said, it takes a hot minute.
No worries.
Still connecting.
Jesus, LinkedIn
Yeah.
does take a
Yeah,
minute. Doesn't it?
if you've ever, I worked with the LinkedIn API in PBWorks. I understand why.
It's LinkedIn. Enough
It's
said.
good Lord. I also updated all of my systems today.
So I updated my Manjaro system and
Holy
found
shit,
out the
dude.
problem with OBS.
Yeah.
There's a massive virtual camera problem with the fucking loopback device.
Yes, correct.
And it's going to be fixed in OBS Studio Project 31.1.
Yep.
No due date on that.
Yeah, it's not out yet because I
Yeah,
didn't see an update because I updated all of the Linux systems that run the podcast here
I
and the
updated.
firewall. My firewall needed to go from 24 to version 25 of
Oh, damn.
OpenSense, and that was dicey. I was like, all right, well, I should take the internet down for the studio. I'm the only one here, but everything seems to be working great. Knock on wood. We are all systems go. Already ready when you are.
Let's do it.
This week, Josh Marpet joins us to discuss H-bombs and F-bombs. Stay tuned for Below the Surface coming up next. Welcome to Below the Surface. It's episode number 50. Nice round number. We're recording on Wednesday, May 7th. I am, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by Josh Marpet. Josh, welcome.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. I've never actually been on Below the Surface before, so this is really cool.
I don't know
My first time.
I lose track. You have to be a Josh to be on Below the Surface recently because we did Josh Bresser's last week. And Josh and I completed the circle, so he's been on both of my podcasts and I've been on both of his podcasts. So
Nice.
we're all good, man. So where are you working today? What's your
I have a
stick?
day job for the first time in almost 15 years. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for Cyturus. I absolutely love it. Cyturus is a platform that does communications for GRC and maturity for GRC and security. So it's an all-over platform that does a lot of stuff. And I get to work on all the frameworks that are being brought in, and we bring in ridiculous amounts of frameworks. I'm currently working on HIPAA, FDA Part 11, and I've got a backlog that you wouldn't believe.
Yeah, oh, that's awesome, man. Well, you're one of my compliance experts, former host of Compliance Security Weekly, which was a show that is no longer a show, but which is sad.
It happens.
So,
It
well,
happens.
we'll bring Josh on this show. We can talk about compliance, which is great. I just want to remind everyone, I have two quick things. So first, Below the Surface listeners can go to eclypsium.com/go. There's a whole bunch of materials there, ultimate guide to supply chain security, some customer case studies, and you can sign up for a demo of our product, all at an easy-to-use URL, eclypsium.com/go. I also want to thank the fine folks at CornCon for gifting us this bottle of whiskey. From CornCon, which it happened to be here on set when I showed up. I've not opened it yet. It's like 2 p.m, so I can't break into whiskey that early in the day anymore. I'm too old for that. So tonight on Paul's Security Weekly, we're going to break into it. So
is Larry going to be there tonight?
Larry will be here tonight.
You will both very much enjoy that. Then.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm looking forward to it. So we're talking about H-bombs and F-bombs, and it's interesting. Behind the scenes, we're having a lot of discussions about these more specific or different bills of materials than software, although there's a lot of similarities between the S-bombs, H-bombs, and F-bombs, and we'll dig into that. But I just want everyone to know that we're working behind the scenes with the goal of, at least my goal, is to get people to start publishing and sharing the bills of materials for the IT security and whatnot technology that we use, right? That's really the goal, to know from the manufacturer what components are inside of it.
Right.
So let's start with I don't know if we've officially adopted these terms. I know SBOM seems to me like the most unofficially official term that we've adopted, right?
SBOM
Your
is kind of
software,
official now.
yeah,
Yeah,
your
like
software bill of materials.
right,
But then
right.
you've got in your mind, Josh, how do you differentiate and define HBOM and FBOM?
Okay, so SBOM, the software bill of materials, is what's inside of your software. Can you rip it apart, autopsy it, whatever you want to call it, and tell me all the Legos? Because let's be honest, most modern software is Lego built. Okay, it's
Sure.
it's pull a library from here, pull a library from there. So I want to open up the covers and see what Legos you've got and glue code you've got in there to hold your software together. With HBOM, a hardware bill of materials, it's similar and a little more. And let me explain.
Mm,
With HBOM, I want to know what's in there. Where did that steel for that hook come from? Where did the aluminum for that frame come from? Whatever. I want to know exactly the same stuff. Where did every piece and part and thingamabob come from in that piece of hardware? And whether it's chips or whether it's a piece of an overhead crane, I don't care. It doesn't matter. All right. Now we're focusing personally. We're focusing more on the computer side of this, the
hmm
microprocessor side of this, but it could go to anything. It doesn't matter. But the difference between the H bomb and the S bomb is that the H bomb also includes where did it come from
That's
physically
interesting. Yeah. So not just what's inside of it, but where did it come from?
and how
What's
long
the
has it been
supply
there?
chain? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, did it sit on a dock in Hong Kong for 6 months? Did it sit in a warehouse
hmm
next to the sea? It's steel and it sat in a warehouse next to the sea for 2 years. Check for rust. That kind of thing. It
hmm
involves environmental pieces as well as a little bit of security. I have a computer here and it's dedicated to CUI, controlled unclassified information, or high side, it's classified information. Did it sit in China for 6 months? Because I may have
hmm
some problems with that. I'm just saying, okay. So there's an element of physical security as well as environmental carefulness, if you will,
hmm
about these things. So I need to know where they were, where they came from. Was forced labor used? Environmental aspects of this are important. Now, the F bomb, the firmware bill of material, and God, I love the name F bomb,
I
is
know, right? It's very silly. It's very. We have stickers. The whole thing. It's very
it's
silly. Yeah.
amazing. But the F bomb, the firmware bill of material, is more similar to the S bomb, the software bill of material, because it concerns who built the firmware, where did the firmware come from, what aspects of the firmware are built into this. Now, firmware, remember, is more of an integrated compiled code rather than Lego built. There's some Legos in firmware, but they're not nearly as many as your average software application, right? And so when you talk about firmware, you're really talking about, hey, who was the author of this firmware? Not which Legos did you get from which places, but who wrote this sucker? Okay. And did they know what they were doing? Has it been tested rigorously? Has it been put through its paces and checked with a pen test, with regression analysis and unit testing and user accept, like the whole 9 yards? What
Right.
has the entire SDLC been for it? And so, in that sense, it's kind of a mix of the two of them, of the hardware and the software. What's inside of it, the software bill of materials, and who built it?
Mm.
Because remember, I mean, how many vulnerabilities and flaws are there at the machine level of firmware and microcode and management planes and such that are either unfixable or just are there and invisible to everybody else? You can run I run every scanner known to man. I don't care. You're not going to see some of this stuff.
Yeah, and that so the best example I have of that is not from like an attack perspective. It's not a great example, but in the context of what we're discussing, Josh, I think it's a great example, and that is your TPM chip that is
Oh
in.
yeah, that's a great one.
I mean, I don't even have to be specific, right? I don't make it look like I'm pick, but name your OEM where you got your laptop from. Inside of that laptop, let's just say there's a TPM chip, and what Quark's lab discovered, this is a couple of years ago now, is that there are vulnerabilities in the firmware of that TPM chip. And when they went back to the manufacturer, I'll make some stuff up just to use as an example, right? Maybe that manufacturer was like, well, there's actually two different types of chips. Maybe one's end of life, one's not. Maybe one, we will support an update. Maybe we as the OEM won't support and update that. Or maybe we will, but we went to our upstream supplier and they were like, well, we've end of life that chip and we already put it in, a million of your laptops. And that was years ago now, and the upstream, who made that chip and the firmware for it is like, yeah, no, like we're done. So you can run into these. kind of paint yourself in a corner situations where you're like, well, I've got this laptop. Maybe it supports Windows 11. Maybe it's great laptop, but I can't update and fix the vulnerabilities in my TPM chip because either my OEM who put all the pieces together or their upstream provider can't support it, won't fix it for whatever reason, right? There's a whole host of reasons. What I want from a bill of materials is a dynamic one that gets updated that tells me those things, right? Or
Yeah.
tells me those things when I buy it. Maybe gives me some indicators of, by the way, this has this type of TPM chip in it, and it'll be supported for this long. Oh, that'll be awesome, right? Then we can sort by before we buy. Tell me about all the components and like what's the one that's going to end of life the soonest, because that's
Right.
really could be the life of that device, right? So,
And turn it around as well and look at your legacy stuff.
mm,
I mean, my favorite story is one that a good friend of mine, Mercurial, gave me. He's awesome. And he did a lot of work with hydro and electric plants all over the place. And apparently there's a transformer on a country border where they send, where they broker electricity back and forth between countries, right?
sure.
And this thing has millions, like it's huge. It's the size of like a large house. Has
Yep.
millions of gallons of oil in it. And inside of the oil floats a computer mainboard that monitors the temperature of the oil,
Oh, I
monitors
remember you telling me. I didn't even
telemetry
know
and stuff.
you could do that. I thought that was really cool when you tell the
Oh
story
well, I
that
mean it's
you
it's
can have
cooling oil, so
electronics floating inside of oil. I'm like, that's pretty
it's
awesome.
it's cooling oil. And no, they actually there are server racks that are filled with mineral oil. They think
Yes.
of a
Yeah, yeah,
server
yeah.
rack, but on its side,
I was talking
same
to
idea.
someone about that. Yep, yep.
So it's floating in the oil and it's transmitting telemetry data out. This transformer is one sealed unit that will not be updated, changed, touched, nothing until I think 2069 or something. That mainboard's running NT351.
Right.
Seriously.
Yes.
Okay. With no service packs. And they're not allowed to put them on. Now,
Yeah,
if you
because what
don't
happens if
have,
you brick the device? Then you're in trouble.
right, you're not allowed, you can't shut this thing down. It's really, really bad. Although the latest tariffs, maybe they will. But anyway, I don't know.
Hmm.
Anyway, so the whole point here is that I need an inventory of everything that is end of life, but I can't touch it. Everything that is going to be end of life, everything that is supported up to this point, but not this way. If I don't have an inventory of, look, what is CIS version 8? The first bloody thing in it is get an asset inventory and then
Right.
get a software inventory, CIS 2. Okay? If I don't have an inventory of what my stuff is, and this is what this is all about. S bombs, H bombs, F bombs, C bombs for compliance bill of materials, whatever you
Yep.
want to call it. I don't care. It's about understanding what you have to protect, where you have to send the money and spend the money, and what you need to do with it all.
I think
You don't get
it
this
really,
stuff.
you're reminding me of something we've been talking about that I'm sure IT teams are now have been talking about for some time, and that's when Windows 10 becomes end of life in October of this
October.
year. Yeah. And the requirements for Windows 11 are really interesting if you dig deeper into the details, other than like most people just, oh, like you need a TPM 2.0. There's a lot of other requirements. I remember our cohort, Lee Neely, was like, yeah, I met all the requirements except my processor isn't new enough. I think you need an eighth gen or later
Or later. I
to
have,
support Windows 11. So he's like, my
yep,
device isn't supported. But I guess Windows would tell you, and Windows has a facility to look at the hardware and tell you what's in there. But that's
right,
important across your entire fleet of all the devices that make up. You need to know what hardware and firmware is in there to know how long that thing's going to live, if it has vulnerabilities, if those vulnerabilities can be fixed, right? And
no,
in the,
no,
and it's interesting in the case of Windows 11, I can't fix the fact, well, maybe in some cases you can, but most of the time I can't fix the fact that the processor is not an 8th gen Intel
right,
processor. I mean, I might, if the motherboard does support an upgrade, maybe, right? But I'd want to know that too. But most of our
well,
enterprises are not, they're not hobbyists like us. They're not going, oh, I'll just swap out my CPU, right? They're not going to recall in everyone's systems and go, oh, we can update your CPU like that. They're just getting a new
they're
system,
not going to
right?
set up an assembly line in the IT shop. Yeah,
Yeah, I don't,
exactly.
somehow I don't see that happening.
But
Maybe,
but
I don't know, but
speaking of enterprises, we're talking about onesies and twosies. I've got a desktop here, Lee's got a
hmm
laptop there, whatever. But when you've got 10,000 laptops deployed
right.
and your hardware refresh cycle goes wonky because you just bought them last year and you're not spec'd to upgrade them for another 2 years because we keep laptops for 4 years or 3 years or five
hmm
years or whatever. Halfway through your hardware refresh cycle, they're like, "Oh, you have to replace all of these. They're not supported anymore."
Right.
What?
And
And if
it's not just support, Josh, too. Some of the things that we've been talking about are which security features
yeah,
are available on this platform. And I like Microsoft's requirements for Windows 11 because a lot of it is speaking to you need this newer hardware that supports these security controls and features inside of your TPM, inside of your UEFI, inside the hypervisor, so that the firmware and software can take
are
advantage
protected.
of those
Yeah.
features, right, and offer better protection. I'm like, this is kind of like Microsoft saying that pre-operating system security is important, and you need to be on the latest versions of things.
Yeah, so I'll be honest. I'm not bitching at. I mean, we're using Microsoft as an example,
Hmm.
but I'm not actually bitching at them. You can actually get support until I think 2027 or
You can.
2028
You can buy support for Windows 10.
for the.
From what I understand, as an individual and as an enterprise, and then there's also the IoT version of Windows, which has a longer support.
Yeah, it's like
It,
2029 or
yeah,
30,
something
something like
like
that.
that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But I don't. I'm not complaining at Microsoft. This is just a fantastic example of
Hmm.
talking about it. But they give you very clear. Like 2 years ago, my desktop was telling me we won't be able to upgrade you to Windows 11. Your TPM doesn't do it.
Yep.
Okay, that gives me plenty of time. But if I had a fleet of 10,000 laptops, I'd be like, oh dear God, this could be awkward. And you got to be careful with that stuff. That's a lot of money. Okay.
Right.
So an H bomb, an S bomb, an F bomb, put them together, and what do you have is a complete blueprint for the future for your hardware refresh cycles, for your security planning, for your security spend, for your understanding of your vulnerabilities, for your attack surface management, for lots of things.
Hmm.
And that's why these things are important. That's why, I mean, you guys are just really weird geeks that want like obsess over having inventories. Well, okay, that's true. But,
Yeah.
but I mean, it's also the fact that if we don't have these things, everybody asks, well, what are table stakes in security these days? And I go, asset inventory, software inventory, information inventory, data flow diagrams, things like that. Those effective
Yeah.
change and patch management. Those are kind of my table
Well,
stakes.
and this gets practical if we look at like Log4j. Josh Bressers was talking about Log4j and the companies that, organizations that could easily weed it out versus ones that couldn't.
Yep.
And so what happens when, I mean, and these vulnerabilities exist today, there's a really bad vulnerability in some hardware component that runs firmware on your systems. You have to be able to go identify that. Same thing with like which software has Log4j. Well, which BMCs have this particular chip and this firmware that is backdoored, right? As an
And
example.
and you've got companies like for example HP, and I'm going to pick on a couple of companies here. And I don't know if they still do this, but it used to be back when I was actually in IT itself. I used to run help desks in IT organizations long, long, long
Long
time
time
ago.
ago.
I would spec HP laptops because I knew that HP bought. They're like, okay, we're going to make 1 million of this version of the laptop, the one I was going to be buying for my people, right?
Right.
They bought 1 million network cards. They literally stockpiled the hardware
Yes.
so that the last laptop that rolled off the assembly line had exactly the same hardware as the first one.
Yep.
And for me, for my sanity, for driver updates, for keeping track of which ones were going to be out of support or vulnerable or whatever, it
Hmm.
was incredible for my sanity. Dell, I'm picking on Dell, but this is actually a more economical way to do it, which is why their
Right.
prices tend to
I
be
think Dell
cheaper.
Dell does have programs. Most now OEMs
The
have
the
programs that you're
big
speaking of, right?
enterprises,
You
yeah,
can go, wait, if I'm going to buy this one, I need to know that it's going to be consistent in all these
yeah.
components. And I think most OEMs will do that for enterprises
But
now.
you had to pay a lot extra for Dell to do that. So, but
Sure,
the
sure,
standard
yeah.
Dell laptops, the low-end enterprise laptops, even the mid-grade ones, if they ran out of network cards, they went and bought, okay, we need a
There's seven
PCIe
different,
network card. Yeah, there were
yep,
7 different
slightly
network cards
different
in there.
model. Maybe it's the same driver, but it's just a different model. Sure, that happens. That happens.
And so what you've got is if you don't have these inventories, if you don't have these understandings of all these things, you're screwed.
Yeah,
But it's just the IT people. They'll live. No, it's not just the IT people. If you've got different management planes for, your 1,000 boxes, your servers that are in your data room or data center or whatever, do you know how many different vulnerabilities are in management planes for Christ's sake? It's
oh
ridiculous.
yeah, yeah, for sure. I want to get into the frameworks and standards.
Sure.
Did AI hallucinate? So I asked AI to generate a guide for us, and Josh and I were like, well, that's good, but also that may not be true. Does CISA have an H-bomb framework? I think it hallucinated that.
No, there is a CISA HBOM framework,
Okay.
but it's and CISA has done some amazing work on this kind of stuff. SBOM frameworks were built out to really a very strong foundational aspect. But you got to understand that CISA is not supposed to make standards per se.
Yeah, they
They
can't
are
force
supposed to
manufacturers to produce these bills of materials.
Right.
It's
So
optional.
they can make preliminary things that then encourage other organizations to make full standards out of, and they make sure that everybody works together. They popularize these standards. They did like for SBOMs, they did plug fests, which
Mm-hmm.
were, hey, bring your application. We'll have some companies build an SBOM. We'll have other companies
Mm-hmm.
consume the SBOM. It was really cool. They sponsored a lot of these events, sort of like a SBOM hackathons, if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And they tried to do the same for H bombs, but I think it petered out a little bit because
Yep.
that came around just as the a lot of the government cuts started happening from
Yep.
various places. So it's really sort of up in the air, and I'm behind the scenes. I'm helping to work out that scenario so that we have an effective H bomb standard. Because look, I need to know if my computer main boards were sitting on a dock in Hong Kong
Right.
for 3 months.
Is that
And
tied into CMMC? Is it a requirement now when the government procures hardware, for example, that it has an H bomb? Therefore, we need an H
nope,
bomb standard, and then we need
right.
another standard or compliance standard, right? To say it has to have this other, H bomb standard. But we're not
Well,
there yet, right?
we need a standard for the H bombs. Then we need a mandate that it must be used.
Right. Right.
And so the idea here is that if we can build a standard, and not necessarily CMMC, because right now adding more government regulations is tough. They're
Yep.
just finishing 32 and 48 CFR for CMMC. I'm one of the original authors of the original
Hmm.
version of CMMC, and I live in that world right now, so it's very strange. But adding more regulations, more mandates to that is problematic. But if you can get any of the DIB, the defense industrial base, to say, hey, we need to know where this hardware has been so that we can
Hmm.
put it into the CIA, we can put it into the USDA, or put it into whatever government agency. Otherwise, we don't know if we can trust it.
Right.
Then that's a fantastic mandate from the commercial side. Similar to what Google and Apple are doing with the certificate lifespans.
Yep.
They're like, oh, look, you can do whatever you want. The law doesn't say you have to have 47-day certificate lifespans. We're just saying that if it isn't a 47-day certificate lifespan, it won't work on an Android phone or an iPhone or an iPad. That's not going to be a problem, right? So sometimes commercial mandates really work well.
Yeah. I think it should be for appliances as well.
Oh, please, dear God, that would be okay. So
Right? Like
Underwriters
I want to
Laboratory.
know, especially if I'm the US government, I want to know what's inside that
Yep.
appliance. I want to know what the manufacturer believes should be in there in terms of hardware and firmware. And then I want to compare it and make sure it doesn't change. Right. And then I want that updated when there is some kind of firmware update. Because
So
this is a
the
dangerous spot that we're in. Attackers, we proved that with certain vendors. Hey, we can use that new shiny remote exploit. And guess what? Once we gain root privileges on the system, if you've got vulnerabilities in bootloaders and UEFI and other firmware-based systems, now an attacker can implant in there. And if I have no visibility into that whatsoever, which is kind of where most manufacturers want to be when they produce these appliances, then I can't tell if there's if I'm at risk or not, and that's the worst place to be.
It's awkward. It's really awkward because and so the scenarios here, so people call it the Manchurian microchip. I don't know if you remember the Bloomberg article that was talking about the grains of rice-sized
Yes.
chips on main boards. I think that was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I
Yeah,
don't
and
remember.
Bunny Huang gave a keynote at Black Hat Asia that I'm trying to get my hands on that talks about hardware, backdoors, different levels of it, and ways to detect it. I think they described
Oh,
it as three different. He describes three different ways to backdoor the hardware and ways in which you can try to detect that hardware-based
oh, I
tampering.
did hear about that. I want to get a copy of that too.
Yeah, it sounds super interesting, right?
Dark Tangent collects a lot of videos from a lot of conferences, including, of course, DEF CON and I think Black Hat.
Yeah.
Hit Dark Tangent up and see if he's got that in the
Well, I mean,
archives.
like I think they post them like 8 months from now. They'll post them to YouTube, but
Oh,
it'd be
when
nice
was
to
which? Oh, was it this recent?
most recent Black Hat Asia
Oh,
like a few
yeah, yeah,
weeks
yeah.
ago. Yeah.
It'll be a few months then. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
absolutely correct. But I think so. So the Manchurian microchip idea is that they can put a remote control chip on, and I've actually seen that happen. Okay, when I was at a federal agency, a quasi federal agency, we had somebody go to Malaysia, and I don't know if you know this, but there's sort of standard customs in a lot of countries,
Mm.
Southeast Asian countries. If you leave your phone in a taxi, the taxi driver goes and drives to a door, hands the phone over, gets handed a wad of bills, and told wait. About 30 to 45 minutes later, they bring the phone back, hand him another wad of bills. That's why he waits.
Mm-hmm.
And then they bring the phone back to you. And then you give them a tip for being so nice to bring the phone back to me. Thank you. They've already stuck that sucker on a Celebrite or something similar to
Sure.
analyze the phone, thrown backdoor software on there, and they own your phone. Okay. It's standard. So don't leave your phone in a taxi in Southeast
Yeah.
Asia, or anywhere for that matter. But, we actually had a phone when I was there. We issued burner phones to anybody going to a country of concern. Okay. Burner phone came back and it had a new chip in it. There was a
Wow.
hardware alteration in the sucker.
I've heard stories. We've heard stories like this of people's laptops as well.
I don't know about laptops, but this one had a
That was
hardware alteration in the phone.
the Mimikatz guy told a story about that,
Really?
where he suspected someone was tampering with his laptop
Oof,
in the room.
that's crazy. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, and there's
it's
certain use cases, in fact, of our commercial software that are validating the firmware and hardware once that device has traveled to another country.
mhm,
It's on deployment, it comes back, and then it gets scanned again, and a comparison is made to see if anything has changed. The
right.
hardware backdoors are difficult to find, though, right?
If they vampire tap some
Yeah,
traces, it's almost impossible to check.
right,
It's like, yeah, you can voltmeter all the traces on the PCB. I don't think so. Come on. So it's difficult, but the software, the vulnerabilities, you should be able to see, like you said, you're checking and creating a baseline before they go, and then
hmm
checking it against the baseline when they get back and seeing if they don't match.
right,
And that's fantastic. But for a normal person, that they don't do that.
right.
And for a normal company, I mean, how many companies do that? Not many. So it's kind of a pain in the ass. So what we're trying to do is make it so it's less of a pain in the ass. It becomes just part of life. It's a cultural change.
hmm
The adversaries are getting more and more sophisticated. We know this to be a fact.
hmm
We are not changing our culture here in the US and the Western world in nearly as fast a pace, primarily because the more we try to change culture from the security and compliance side, the more we're seen as a cost center.
Right.
And the people who say no, and I don't want to be that way, but
Yeah.
we've got to change something. It's absolutely imperative that we change something about this culture.
And the firmware bill of materials is very interesting as well. This is where I think we've made more strides, where it's easier for developers to produce that manifest of what's inside that firmware, and then check it. And some are doing better than others, right? But this is primarily, I
Why do you think
think,
that some are doing better than others? What makes some companies do more
so
work on that?
some companies are producing an SBOM, actively updating all the software, using
Hmm.
tools in their SDLC to make sure that all the components are updated. Even upon request, we'll give you like the patches that they've applied that don't get picked up on a lot of SBOM kind of related tools or SCA.
That's nice.
Right? Isn't that, and that's really like going the extra mile to go, look, when you get this build from us, here's everything that's inside. Here's all the patches that we did for security, updated all the packages. And by the way, if we backported a fix, we'll give you a manifest of those patches as well. And that's transparency that
I
it
love that.
inspires confidence, right? That
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
this
exactly.
software
That's it.
is resilient, right?
And that's the point. If we inspire confidence through transparency, openness, and honesty about problems that we have as manufacturers, as vendors, as whatever, and the successes that we have, hey, we've patched all these issues and we're doing beautiful. Let me tell you about what the patches entail. Whether it's the firmware, the hardware, I don't care. But if we do practice openness, honesty, and transparency as manufacturers and as vendors, we're going to be inspiring confidence in the
Yep.
people that understand that
And
that
being
should inspire
proactive about
confidence.
it too, because
Yeah.
I've said this on numerous podcasts, right? That the vulnerability that might exist inside your firmware is that reachable or not? I mean, it depends. I mean, it could just be a vulnerability in a binary that's just sitting on the system, right?
Yeah.
And yeah,
It's the Swiss
someone needs
cheese
to be
analogy.
on the system in order to exploit it. But likely, if they're already on the system,
You've got worse
they're
problems.
their root level user anyway. So that local vulnerability doesn't help them any further. But the great manufacturers that are producing these things are patching those too, right? And just being proactive about it, which I
Well,
think is great.
it's the Swiss cheese approach. It's like, there's a hole there, but it doesn't go all the way through the wedge of Swiss cheese, so I don't care
Yeah,
about it.
right,
But you know what? Let's just patch it just in case. Okay, cool. We got time. Let's do it right. But those are the manufacturers, those are the vendors that are actively have a positive security culture, a
right.
positive compliance culture, a
Hmm.
positive SDLC culture. Again, it's a cultural change.
Hmm.
And this is crossing all the boundaries. This is security. This is development. This is firmware. This is hardware. This is compliance. Uh, we have to move to a continuous security, continuous compliance, continuous management of our development,
Right.
of our
And we
firmware, of
have
our
to
software,
rely on
everything.
suppliers, especially in the firmware and
Yeah,
hardware. We're talking about your bills of materials for firmware and hardware. We have to rely on our OEMs and upstream vendors because oftentimes we can't mess with that stuff ourselves, right?
amazingly enough, we have to trust our supply chain.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
When it comes to software, open source software, or software higher up in the stack, it's much more pliable, malleable. You can update it.
Yeah.
There's not as much like trouble doing that. But when you get deeper into the system, those dependencies on numerous things make it super difficult and sometimes not possible to update.
So I want to, the dependencies point you just raised is huge. And I want to point that out because 20 years ago, software had very few to no dependencies. And hardware was the same way. Like I had a piece of hardware, this is the thing that I did the processing on, or the servers in the room over there, or down the street at our data center, whatever. But I had a self-contained world. You know
Mm,
what I mean? And nowadays, how many of the things that we do, I've got to go to a cloud service for this and a different cloud service for that, and I've got to go to, this thing and I've got to send it to that third party for processing. I pull data from those places with integrations that go back off into the cloud to do the integrations for me because I'm using an API gateway that's hosted or whatever. Like, and we expect all of this to still work and be secured as if it was still sitting in the box on my desk, and that's just not the truth anymore.
right. And these various
So
components, you may have multiple companies that you have to go get the updates from to update all of your different components.
And so I feel like I'm playing a broken record because I say this so many damn times, but the world is not as tiny as it used to be. It's simultaneously
Yeah.
smaller, but it's simultaneously much bigger because every process, every business process I do, I'm talking to 30 different third parties that are outside my perimeter, outside my firewall. They're on the super highway called the World Wide Web. God, I feel old.
Mhm.
And the information superhighway. And so I've got to keep track of this stuff. And I keep track of it with S bombs, H bombs, F bombs. Okay.
Mhm.
And I changed the culture to be a continuous culture of looking at, of transparency. I know I've harped on this. I apologize. I don't mean to. But it's incredibly, the biggest thing here is that cultural change is something that is so difficult for people to see and for businesses to want to pay for.
Yeah. So that's a great segue into why manufacturers don't want to publish bills of materials. There's
Oh,
hesitation there.
there's some legitimate hesitation. A software bill
Sure.
of material is, hey, would you like to hack me? Here's how you can do it.
Hmm.
Okay. But you do it under an NDA. Like it's the same thing as SOC 2 report gives every vulnerability that's in my infrastructure, right? So that's why a SOC 2 report is only given out under NDA. Same idea. Okay. You're going to give it out under NDA. Is there any difference? I don't see any.
Mm.
So,
There's
but
licensing concerns too. If
well, that's what SBOMs are
is it-
designed. Like literally, SBOMs started off with licensing. So if you're
yeah,
doing
I guess
something
they
wrong,
have to be willing to do the due diligence first and then work towards publishing the bills of materials. And I think they don't want to do that initial because it's a resource, it's a cost, right?
it's a
To
cost.
now I have to build it into my SDLC. I have got to generate it. I've got to QA it, check it, all that stuff,
But
and
here's
there's a
the
cost
thing.
to it.
I talked to JC Hers, who she was the CEO of Ion Channel .io and Exeger bought her company. And Ion Channel has a product. Now Exeger has the product, but the product is basically, you tell us who your software suppliers are. We will keep track of all of their SBOMs. We'll get all their SBOMs from them under NDA through you. You know, we'll chain the
Yeah, I
NDA.
gotcha. Yep.
We'll get the SBOMs, we'll keep track of them, and we'll look through them and go, this one's outdated by 3 versions. This library is outdated. This library has 15 vulnerabilities. And what she told me was that it effectively is revenue neutral typically, because the vulnerability management program and threat intelligence program for your company is effectively now front-ended by something that does it automatically.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't cost as much as people think. And they're the ones that they're like, supplier, you got a library that's 4 versions outdated. They put the pressure on the supplier. It doesn't have to wait until it gets into your systems and then gets caught by the vulnerability scanner, gets assigned a ticket, has 3 of your guys working on it to check out what they can do. Oh, it's from this supplier. Let's go talk to them
Mm-hmm.
and keep track of that ticket. No, they manage it all. So, JC is awesome, by the way. If you ever want to talk SBOMs and how to proactively use them, she's amazing in that
Right.
sense.
That's the trick, is you have to use them. Just having
Yes,
them is one thing, but you
right.
have to actually incorporate them into your program and
But
act upon them.
it can become revenue neutral or even be profitable, a revenue center of sorts, less cost actually, because it reduces your need for that fire hose of threat intelligence.
Right.
Just saying.
Yeah. Um, are there other compliance standards that lean on H bombs, S bombs, F
Not
bombs?
not that I know of, not as of yet, but we're starting to see them. A lot of agencies and a lot of organizations do things that are forward looking. They put out newsletters and bulletins, and I'll give you an example. NACHA, the National ACH Association,
Mm-hmm.
like 3.5, 4 years ago, put out a bulletin that said, in the near future, we expect uh, at rest, in transit, and in use encryption to be utilized. I have spent hundreds of hours explaining in use encryption to people because
Mm-hmm.
though they read that, like, what the, huh? And so I went, okay, let me explain in use encryption. It's really weird. It's an obscure branch of mathematics that is being brought to the forefront because of this one organization that said we expect it to start happening. So there are certain things out there, there are bulletins out there that are starting to say things like software bill of materials are great. There's other bill of materials we should be using as well. So the more forward-looking companies are starting to see this and starting to say, hey, we should probably talk about this, at least figure out what the hell they are.
Yeah.
But there's nothing that's regulated that I know of as of yet, except for medical devices. Medical devices
They
have
do,
FDA
yes.
Part 11 and various other ones, 62443 for software, things like that. There are some niche or specific verticals that, while not calling out HBOM, hardware bill of materials, they do call out you better be able to trace back where your stuff came from, which is
Yeah.
equivalent to an HBOM and an FBOM,
Well,
right?
and it's interesting. Is there such a thing as an encryption or cryptographic bill of materials?
Please don't.
I mean, we're slightly off topic, but I'll give you I'll give you a couple of use cases, right? One, and I'll relate this to firmware, right? Because that's largely what we work on. Inside of that firmware, is it using quantum safe algorithms to do whatever it's doing, right? There's lots of different firmware that you need to do some type of cryptographic operations, right? Maybe
Right, because you need to
the web
decrypt the
interface is
disk drive.
HTTPS or whatever, yeah.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
I have to use encryption. I have to use cryptographic technology to provide secure boot, right, inside
right,
of my embedded system or IoT device. And the first question is it quantum safe?
right,
Second question, are you using air quotes safe encryption standards? In other words, how you're storing passwords on the system, is that using a
right.
safe hashing algorithm inside of it? And I've seen vulnerabilities come out
Oh, yeah,
recently that are being patched, that have been observed, reported, and patched, of going, look, you're using an insecure method to store user passwords. You're using an insecure whatever the encryption algorithm is to do firmware updates or to
right.
apply to secure boot, right? So I think this was probably part of the other bills of materials and not one on its own, but I think it's really important. It's another aspect of what we're talking about.
Well, And it's fascinating because, and this is sort of your world over at Eclypsium, is in the firmware is its own self-contained little computer,
Right.
right? Because the firmware has to decrypt the hard drive, which means it can't call the decryption library that's on the hard drive because it's still encrypted.
Right.
Okay, so it has to decrypt the hard drive. It has to boot up all the pieces, it's in the hardware
Has to
abstraction layer.
understand.
It has to.
So an interesting point on that is the bootloader has to understand file systems, and
Yes.
recent rounds of vulnerabilities traced back to a number of different modules inside of the code, inside of Grub, for example, that
Hmm.
have vulnerabilities in the way that they're trying to understand and implement file systems in the bootloader, because the bootloader has to
Oh,
read stuff from various different file systems. And if you look over the 40 something vulnerabilities Microsoft found in Grub this year, a lot of them are file system based.
that's fascinating. I didn't know that. Oh my
Hmm.
goodness. And so it has to have everything, and it's almost like I need to start up this computer, the firmware computer, the mini firmware computer, right? And the boot system, and I need to start it up, and it has to be so self-contained that it can decrypt itself,
Hmm.
then decrypt the disk drives, then do this. And how are you storing the passwords, the decryption key for that? Like it's crazy how difficult that is.
Yeah.
And yet we just leave them running for 10 years and never update them because, oh my God, updating the BIOS is so much of a pain in the ass, right?
And let's hope we didn't, no one ever loses a key, private key,
Oh God,
which
don't even
that's
get this
happened.
started. Well, why did
Kali
Entrust?
Linux just we covered the story later tonight, but they lost one of their key, not because they got hacked, but just because they're like they misplaced it. And I empathize with that because I lose stuff all the time.
I
You know
have
what
at
I mean?
least I have at least four public key sigs that I
Hmm.
can't revoke because I can't find my private key
Right,
passphrases.
happens.
So
So
it's
key
it's
management is, it's an interesting issue, but the algorithms that you're using, the encryption technology that's inside of your devices needs to be part of a bill of materials
yep.
so that we can identify it and identify the risk and hopefully update it. In a lot of cases, though, in smaller embedded systems and firmware, it can be difficult to update and sometimes impossible. But
But your point is a really good one for firmware, for hardware, for software, for encryption, for all of these things. For your compliance, we need to be able to generate some way that we can validate and verify and have transparency, visibility into how vulnerable we are.
right.
And then we need to be able to update them on a continual basis so that as time goes on, we know what our risks are. We operate so many times on, well, my risk last December when I had my last pen test was this. Yeah,
Hmm.
that doesn't matter. What is it now?
Right. Awesome. What else on H bombs, F bombs, Josh? Do you
Oh
do you
man,
encounter
there's
you
so
encounter
much.
different questions? I know you do a lot of advising on companies too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm starting to get more questions on H bombs. I'm getting
Hmm.
a few more questions on firmware. It's still not a popular topic. People don't want to think about it,
No,
but
because they don't.
it's
Firmware and hardware is something that most people don't want. It's not in your face, right? The example I give is your operating system and your web browser are, forgive the description, right? But they're very vocal about saying, "Hey, there's an update. You need to update to the latest version."
I gotta go find if my BIOS has an
Yeah.
update. I gotta go
Right.
find.
If
I gotta
we get
search.
we get before the operating system or on these smaller devices that don't have a great firmware update mechanism, that it's out of sight of the user, right?
Right.
Devices don't have a monitor, mouse, and keyboard. Even the firmware in your PC servers and laptops is not something I interface with every day, right? Every day I log into my operating system. Every day I open up a web browser, and that's where I see the system. But those components that lie underneath aren't in your face. They're not often not telling you that there's an update. I mean, there are some facilities and software that helps you with that. Some from your OEM, some open source like FWUpd tells you about all of the hardware components that it can try and update for you, right, on Linux systems. So
Right. But the problem is that you've got it, so it's invisible. It's a
hmm
pain in the ass to do, and nobody wants to think about it because my God, I've got other things I've got to do. I've got a
well,
list
and
as
it's
long as my
yeah,
arm.
and downtime could be bad if the firmware update goes wrong. Because
I've taken
we've
down an
never
entire casino.
experienced right, yeah, we've never experienced downtime in our IT and security careers from updating software or firmware.
I have literally, I have literally taken down an entire casino doing an update
Yeah.
and was held by armed gunmen in the casino for about 40, no, about 48 hours, 2.5 days, something like that, until I could fix it before they'd let me go.
Oh God.
Just the way it
I was just
was.
telling you before the show, I updated my firewall, needed a firmware update, and the internet was down while I was doing it, right? And I think this is the challenge that folks have, keeping their systems, up to date with respects to firmware, firewall, VPN appliances. We've talked about that on previous shows, just how difficult those things are. So,
It is, you know, these are important, but they're not sexy. They're not shiny.
yeah,
But these are things that need to be done. And these are things that need to be monitored. And these are things that need to be watched. And these are things that need to be kept track of. And if you don't, somebody clever is going to go, look at that little hole he left for me.
right, right. Yeah,
And
and
that's
the thing
really
we've
the
always
key.
harped on, right, is this lower level access gives attackers persistence, stealth, and impact are my three things, right? So I can persist on these systems through reboots and firmware updates, software updates. I've got some stealth. I can hide from various tools that are trying to provide visibility because I'm so low in the system. And impact. I could potentially brick the system or destroy it and have great impact. So all things to keep in mind. Josh, thank you so much for
Hey,
coming on the show today, talking about all the various bills of materials. It was great having you. Uh,
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching this edition of Below the Surface. We'll see you next time.